Solutions. Once again, welcome to the Trainer podcast, in which I try to bridge the gap between science and practice and science. Today, I'm talking with Jonathan Wender. He's from Polis Solutions. He will introduce himself later. I first came about his work, I think, when he had a beautiful concept of T3, Tact, Trust, and Tactics. And I was writing my book. He behind me, Frontline Training, and I was looking for a coherent model for police training and the philosophy of policing. And your model, I'm not sure if you have it right now still, but it was a great integrated model of the philosophy of policing and training. So thank you so much for talking with me.
No, thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy following your work, and as you and I were discussing, it's a pleasure to see all this cross-fertilization of ideas and practice on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think there's hope for police reform and for social practice more generally, and we can have the kinds of conversations I know we'll have today.
Great. Maybe before, because we want to talk about the use of video, eh?
Yes.
But before that, can you give a short history of Polis Solutions and where it came from? And you had also incredible research before, the ADEPT report. I think Jules Suss also worked with you.
Yes.
And you published a lot of, even the old paper, what's old, but I really like the Good Stranger and
Yes.
all that kind of work. Can you give a short overview about
Yes,
Polis
of
Solutions?
course. So by way of brief introduction for your audience, I'm Jonathan Wender. I'm an admittedly improbable combination of social scientist, police veteran, and entrepreneur. I spent 20 years in the policing world in the United States. And on the academic side, I'm a social scientist whose area of expertise is face-to-face interactions in high-risk environments where trust is low and risk is high. So I'm very much interested in how theory and practice intersect to understand and improve at scale how people interact with each other in police, military, national security, and other high consequence environments. My academic and police work led me to my good friend and our other co-founder of Polis, Dr. Brian Landy. Brian and I spent several years at DARPA, which as some European folks may not know, is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's part of the U.S. Department of Defense. DARPA is tasked with trying to solve very, very difficult scientific and technical problems that have fundamental implications for defense and national security. So Brian and I put together and ran a large program called Good Stranger. And so Eric, as you alluded to, some work came out of that. The concept in the Good Stranger is that in military operations, even when violence occurs, when combat occurs, when there are kinetic operations, to use the sort of cold bureaucratic term, even when that happens, there always has to be a political end state to combat. No matter how brutal the fighting is, the end state of warfare always has to be political, right? This is back to Clausewitz for folks who know their military history, right? War is a continuation of politics through other means. So what we did at DARPA is try to think through how we could better measure and analyze trust at scale. How do we understand the ebb and flow of human interactions and look for universal principles of social interaction that we can leverage in training, that we can leverage in operations, or in order to build trust, recognizing that at the end of the day, when combat ceases or when we're trying to tamp down combat operations, we need to stabilize the environment. So our particular concern at the time was operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. How do we improve face-to-face interactions between military personnel and people in counterinsurgency environments, stability operations, post-combat operations, counter-ID operations, and so forth? We did a lot of pioneering work at DARPA in the use of what's called multimodal technology to measure human interactions. And multimodal simply means we're taking different modes of sensing and measuring how people are interacting. To telescope to the present, when Brian and I left DARPA in 2014, we co-founded Polis with the mission of continuing what we started under the government umbrella. Polis And I just a bit of trivia for your listeners. The word polis comes from the ancient Greek word, city, state, polis. And of course, the word polis is the root of politics and police, cosmopolitan, metropolitan. So we wanted to evoke that sense of unity among people, right?
Mhm.
Political and social unity. So Polis's mission is to analyze human interactions in order to make them better. What we do is use a wide range of technologies to understand how people interact. And based on our understanding of human interaction, as well as our understanding of domain expertise in fields like policing, we build training systems and technology that help police departments, private security, and other kinds of entities improve outcomes of face-to-face interactions. And so, Eric, as you mentioned, one of our early efforts when we came out of DARPA was a program called T3, Tact, Tactics,
Yeah.
and Trust. The premise behind T3 is that if we're going to train police officers to optimize the outcome of their interactions, we need to break down silos, right? Historically, in my training, when I think back to when I was a new officer, when I think of training, which unfortunately still prevails in much of the world, we tend to teach things in a compartmentalized, isolated fashion. So we're going to learn to talk in this class, we're going to learn firearms in that class, we're going to learn de-escalation in a third setting. What we tried to do in T3 is break down those boundaries and say, look, in the operating environment, all these skills have to be marshaled simultaneously. And so we have to teach them holistically and improve the capacity of police officers to be agile, adaptable, and creative. And Eric, as you also mentioned, out of T3 was born another project called ADAPT, which
Mhm.
stands for Adaptive, Defensive, and Protective Tactics. And what we did in ADAPT was build on what we learned in T3 and went deeper into the weeds on understanding how we can teach adaptive decision making to police personnel. And then most recently, also the next generation of work coming out of T3, we did a project also funded by the US government where we built a new course called Basic Skills of Influence,
Mm.
where we teach police personnel how to understand and positively influence other people's emotions. And the study around that new training is closing soon. But there's a new course that came out of that, which we piloted in Virginia Beach. For folks who are not familiar with Virginia Beach, it's a fairly large city on the Atlantic coast of the US, not far from Washington, D.C. So we've been doing that, and I know, Eric, you also mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work with video analytics, with looking at body-worn camera data in order to understand at scale the nuances and patterns of how police and community members interact. So let me stop that wandering introduction.
Wow. So many ways to go. Um, I'm not sure. Something triggered me because we talked before about adaptive decision making, and we talked again now. Maybe just double click on it for a second. If we take the old OODA cycle in all its complexity from John Boyd, there's not just a simple cycle, but the whole cycle. It seems that the orientation phase is a very important phase, where in the orientation phase your cultural lenses, your history, your whatever, your training. What makes decision making such a central element in your programs?
When I think about decision making, I think about the fact that your decision making, more than anything else, for me, refutes the misconception that theory and practice are separate, right? So theory always presupposes a certain understanding of the life world, right? Of the lived world, of the totality of physical and social existence. And practice, similarly, always brings into play a given set of theoretical presuppositions, right? When I approach the world in a practical way, whether I'm cooking a dinner or confronting a suspect or driving a car or looking at the stars, I'm bringing to bear a certain set of theoretical presuppositions. So, like you, Eric, I fall into this long intellectual tradition, which comes out of European philosophy of science and phenomenology and other threads. And I think all of us agree that the idea that theory and practice are separate is a false dichotomy. So to bring that to center, when I think about decision making, what I'm trying to understand, what my colleagues are trying to understand, is how experts in so-called noisy environments do a better job of looking at patterns, even in dynamic, complicated environments, and quickly understanding what's going on, right? How do they separate signal from noise, or the wheat from the chaff, or whatever metaphor you may want to use? Um, the error of so much training, which again goes back to this false notion that theory and practice can be separated. And you remember this from the ADAPT report. Our mantra in ADAPT is teach situations, not techniques. Technique-based training, whether it acknowledges it or not, is born of this idea that, well, look, over in a classroom, we can talk about theory, right? We can talk about some general concepts, but over here, we're going to talk about practical skills. And to bring this to a very basic example, let's think about young children and how young children learn art skills. Children, even at the age of 4 or 5, when they're in kindergarten or preschool, we don't sit them down and say, well, here's a crayon, and here's how you pick it up and write, and here's a pair of scissors, and here's glue, and here's paint. What we do instead is say, look, today we're going to build a birdhouse, or we're going to make a collage. We give kids a project, and we throw them into this complicated environment. We give them lots of different tools, and we let them figure out how to solve the problem. And it often makes me smile and frown at the same time that when we train our police officers, and when I say our, I'm speaking of the US, I don't want to presume to know more than I do about European policing, but certainly here in the US, a lot of the way in which we train our police officers here, sadly, doesn't even come up to the standard of the way in which we teach 5-year-old children art skills, right? We take isolated skills. Here's how to use handcuffs, here's how to use a baton, here's how to use pepper spray, instead of making decision-making the focus, right? Because that is what people do. People are constantly making decisions. The core skill of policing is decision-making. That, therefore, should be what we focus on centrally. And, I'll just quickly say this, and then I'll come up for air. I was reading a magazine, the new magazine came out. I was looking at a series of articles on police decision-making, and sadly, even in the year 2024, these new articles all fall back on the same tired old thinking, right? Well, it's abstract general concepts, but no one really sits and gets into the weeds like you do so well, Eric, and really try to think, how do we take the science of decision making and turn that into more effective praxis in the field?
What is the current state of decision making? I try to follow it, but maybe I'm not at actual anymore. I think I understood Kahneman. I understood Klein. They also wrote a great paper, by the way, Failure to Disagree, where both how do you call it? Both views on decision making were acceptable. But nowadays we have also just adaptive decision making. There is even a concept like adaptive expertise.
Yes.
With real consequences for training also.
Yes.
Where are you standing on this?
So let me begin by giving you a practical example. It's a project we recently concluded, and we're in the midst of another one. So as we talked about briefly, Eric, the ADAPT project, adaptive defensive and protective tactics, the original intent of the ADAPT project was to focus on use of force decision-making for officers, right? How can we teach officers to be adaptive decision makers in face-to-face confrontations? But as you've started to suggest, the concept of adaptive decision-making or adaptive expertise can be applied, of course, in many different fields. It can be applied in policing, in medicine, in aviation, and so forth. Within policing, we've taken that model of adaptive decision-making and we've applied it to a number of different contexts. I'm going to give you an example of a couple of projects we just finished with the Cleveland Police Department. Again, for folks listening in Europe, if you're not familiar, Cleveland is a fairly large city, in the Midwest of the U.S., not far from Chicago. We have been doing some work with the Cleveland Police Department, or Cleveland Division of Police, as they call it, to improve their training and to make it more science-based. So we took the ADAPT model and developed a course on decision-making for supervisors responding to use of force incidents. To create this training, we took video of actual incidents from Cleveland, so actual incidents where Cleveland officers are interacting with the public, and we used an adaptive decision-making model to unpack scenarios and to pose to students, both in classroom and online environments, key questions around the decision-making process. And so to your point, Eric, the idea here is to improve and standardize the development of expertise among Cleveland leaders. One of the errors that so many experts make is that we assume that experts make decision in an informal and unstructured way, that it's intuitive, seat of the pants, but of course it's not. So in this particular course, we take a number of videos and we unpack them layer by layer. We ask students at so-called decision points, key cues they recognize, what they would do next to justify their chosen course of action. Then we bring students together in a seminar setting and they talk through their decisions. The overall point here being to standardize how decisions are made around use of force and to accelerate how expertise is developed within the Cleveland Division of Police. We just finished that project last year. We are beginning another project also with Cleveland where we use that same model to teach investigators who are handling internal affairs cases. And internal affairs is, these are cases where police officers have been accused of various kinds of misconduct, excessive force, and so on. And again, while investigations are not the same as what happens on the street, the decision-making pattern is the same. So how do we unpack the key elements of decision-making? In the model we use in Cleveland, we have a term we call LATES factors, right? So when we're teaching decision-making, LATES in English, it stands for legal, administrative, tactical, ethical, and social. And back to the idea that adaptive expertise is recognizing and organizing cues in the environment, we teach students in the classroom as well as online, every time you confront a situation, we want you to look for those cues: legal, administrative, tactical, ethical, and social. Now, experts do this anyway, right? So an expert is already doing this intuitively. We're trying to make that intuitive process more conscious, more deliberate, not only to enhance the current experts, but to allow us to systematically take that knowledge and impart it to new leaders.
Great. And the decision making, the adaptive part, if we just made it as simple as possible, what is needed in training to develop problem solvers, to adaptive problem solvers? What is the key ingredient? Even if you have no single theoretical idea of decision making, but what is needed in training for a trainer?
So this is a really important question. I'm glad you brought this up. For us, at the most basic level, it comes down to cognitive and emotional complexity, right? And here's where there's a common error that gets made in policing and military and other kinds of training. Physical realism does not necessarily translate into more and better learning. That is to say, just because we put people in a simulator or a live scenario environment where bullets are flying and we have mock injuries and sirens and screaming and smoke and all of that, that kind of training, depending on how it's structured, may or may not get us where we want to be. Now, at a minimum, training like that is very expensive in terms of time and money. It's expensive, but we know, and this goes back to a lot of the research around adaptive decision making. This, you mentioned Gary Klein and Kahneman and so many others. And this is work that Joel Suss has done, and so many other folks whom Anders Ericsson. To accelerate expertise, you don't necessarily need physical realism. What you need is cognitive challenges, right? You need to challenge people's minds to think through the complexity of what happens in the operating environment. So to that point, when we take video scenarios, right, what Polis believes, given limited resources, and I mean limited time and limited money, if we're going to develop expertise, we need to give officers lots and lots of repetitions of situations that may have low visual fidelity. Maybe we're just watching a video, but cognitively it's real, right? We're challenging them to think through, well, what about this and what about that? And well, you might think that A was happening, but now suppose that B is happening. And
Mm.
those sorts of cognitive and affective exercises, that for us is the bedrock of how expertise gets developed. Adaptive decision makers are constantly thinking through patterns of response, patterns of cues, patterns of response. And to teach that, you don't need $100 million training facility.
Great. Now you also bring up a topic. This is not for this conversation, but maybe for a follow-up, because I want to move to the video. But today I'm struggling a lot with the ecological dynamic approach, especially because it seems, and I'm not an expert, it seems that the cognition part is, well, Joel just reacted on LinkedIn about it, whereas the cognition aspect of motor learning, learning in general. But it's a forthgoing project for myself. But Dave Collins also produced a great paper about it. He's a British performance psychologist. He talks about it depends coaching, where he contrasts the cognitive versus the non-cognitive approaches. But I say that because it seems to me that, like in the States now, the ecological dynamic approach to motor learning, this is of course not all learning, is getting a lot of attention. But for that,
No, I agree with you. And I mean, for us, the essence of decision-making training is to combine the practical and the mental, right? We have to combine cognitive
yeah,
skill and affective skill, right? We have to understand the intersection of emotion and cognition
yeah,
in complex environments.
yeah, yeah,
And again, this is why we need to teach holistic situations rather than isolated skills, because frankly, the kind of emotional stimulation you get when you teach holistic situations is much higher than teaching an isolated skill.
yeah. One last question, then we move on to the video.
Sure.
How was it to work with the great Ericsson? You worked with him.
We did. We had the privilege of working with Anders Ericsson for a number of years before his untimely death. First, I have to say, I always, his humanity, his humility, his kindness and generosity were, really inspirational. And the world is full of brilliant people who aren't always, whose souls don't always match their intellects. I think Anders had a shining soul, and he more than being a brilliant scientist, he understood the practical implications of his work, and he
Mm.
cared deeply about the impact of his work on real world situations, on nursing, on policing, on aviation. And I think that gave him that sort of drove his generosity. But he was one of the first to challenge us in the early days of Polis to double down on adaptive decision making, right? To
Mm.
think about how we could make adaptive decision making and deliberate practice front and center. And if I had to name one person to whom we really want to give credit for the whole adapt model, it's really Anders, right? It's he who told us you really have to teach adaptive decision making. You have to think about deliberate practice holistically, and it was also he who inspired us to understand, as I've said a couple of times here, that visual fidelity, high-tech gee-whiz training isn't necessarily effective, right? It can be. If it used well, it can be wonderful, but left to its own devices without the kind of rigorous apparatus that Anders helped us build and helped so many other people build, without that apparatus, you just have a lot of fun technology that may be exciting to use, but doesn't necessarily pay the sorts of dividends that Anders knew had to be paid if we're really going to improve practice in those critical moments.
What is the best book or article to read for police trainers if they are interested in
Oh,
the scientist?
best my favorite Ericsson article. Some of his early papers on adaptive decision making or on deliberate practice.
Mm.
I I'm gonna have to think. I have too many book titles swirling in my head, and I acknowledge I'm embarrassed that I can't think of a couple of favorite papers. Some of his papers on music.
Mm.
There's some favorites that are not as well known, but I'll send you some for your
Yeah,
readers.
great. Yeah. Let's talk about, I'm not sure how you called it, but we had a little chat on LinkedIn because there came a study out of, I think, out of For Science with
Yes,
Dr. Murray. I also interviewed Dr. Murray, and as I said, I'm not an expert. I just read the research, and for me, it seems like the message was body worn cameras give a very limited uh, point of view, so you cannot rely on them. I'm not sure if I'm. This was what I took. Maybe I'm totally wrong, but and you reacted with you were doing also all kind of things with video. What are you up to?
sure. So, and by coincidence, one of my colleagues and I just had a great conversation yesterday with a couple of our colleagues at Force Science. Um, I have a lot of respect for the
Yeah,
research Force Science does. Um, I Something where we in Force Science and many other, I'd like to say, forward-linking folks agree. In the world today, if someone said to me, Jonathan, what's the largest source of data in the world on policing? It's body-worn camera video. Whether we're talking about the US or the UK or the Netherlands or Germany or France, or pick whatever country you want, the proliferation of body-worn cameras has led to the collection of this massive trove of data. And it quantitatively, there's nothing like it. And qualitatively, there's nothing like it. By that, I mean, if we want to understand the nuances, the patterns of how police officers interact with the public, there's nothing else like body-worn camera footage to help us get to that point. Now, I understand, and I think this is one of the points Force Science is making, a the perspective of a video camera, whether it's worn on a police officer's chest or whether it's a drone or whether it's a helicopter or a dashboard or a television camera at a sporting event, I take it for granted that the camera will never capture or replicate exactly what the person in that moment saw. However, I don't think anybody would disagree, whether it's my colleagues at Force Science or anyone else, that um, when you have as large a body of video as we have in police body-worn camera footage, it's critically important to find the best way possible to analyze that data at scale and use the results to improve practice and outcomes. So one of the things that we've been doing recently at Polis is going back to work we started at DARPA around the analysis of face-to-face interaction. Late last year, in October of 2023, we released a new service, a new product called TrustStat. TrustStat is the first system in the world that uses what's called multimodal artificial intelligence, multimodal AI, to automatically go through body-worn camera footage and look for key interactional patterns. So we take body-worn camera video. We use three different kinds of technology. We use computer vision, so we're looking at how people interact, right? We're looking at emotions, gestures, movement, how animated are people, are emotions negative or positive? Is an interaction getting more or less confrontational? We analyze what people say using natural language processing. How are people speaking? The content of their speech, and we also look at how they're saying it using speech processing. So we take these three kinds of artificial intelligence, computer vision, natural language processing, and speech processing, and we merge those signals together to tell a coherent story about an interaction. And then wrapped around all of that is our background in modeling human interactions and working in fields like policing. So to take the example of this current conversation, even though you're in the Netherlands and I'm in the United States, this is a live social interaction.
yeah,
And uh, when Eric and Jonathan interact, even across several thousand miles, you're monitoring my behavior and I'm monitoring yours. You're listening to what I say and how I say it, and I'm doing the same with you. Now, your English is a lot better than my Dutch, so we're speaking in English, but even across differences in language, culture, nationality, and so on, we're able to carry on this coherent interaction. So what we do in our body-worn camera analytics work, we treat each interaction as a dynamic system. So, and by analogy, whether it's an Aikido match or a judo match or a football game or surgeons in an operating room or a pilot and co-pilot on a flight deck, when people interact, we can never just look at one person, right? So if we want to understand the interaction occurring right now between Eric and Jonathan, we can't just say, well, let's just look at what Jonathan is saying. What did Jonathan say? We have to look at how each of us, Eric and Jonathan, how is each one of us contributing to this interaction and making it either better or worse? So when we think about policing, what we are doing with TrustStat is analyzing at a very large scale, lots and lots of video to understand what makes some interactions succeed and what makes some fail, sometimes catastrophically. Now, as you know, and I only know the statistics for the US, but I'm guessing they're comparable, if not much lower in Europe. In American policing, 97 to 99% of police interactions involve no violence or force at all, which is remarkable, right?
Yeah.
When you take a country as large and diverse as the United States, and a country where, frankly, there is a deeply rooted tradition of individualism where people don't necessarily like to be told what to do, nonetheless, even in this huge, diverse country, violence between the police and the public is incredibly rare. That rareness of violence is not a product of random chance. It's something that occurs for reasons we can understand and predict. So anyway, that's a bit of what we're doing.
Oh, I did not expect you to stop right here.
Oh, well, you know,
No,
I have to sometimes, well, so I'll quickly say this.
But I think it's
Go
important to
ahead, cut
say,
me off.
no, of course we have to go on, but what you say is so important because some studies show that I have read some US studies where students think that 50% of police civilian interactions result in violence and so on. And I think in the Netherlands also people think that a lot of times there is use of force, and these are important statistics.
Absolutely. And by the way, and so I'm going to kind of make fun of myself here, and I'll just talk about if we rewind this interaction about a minute, I stopped talking abruptly because I thought, well, you know, Jonathan talks a lot. He better be quiet and give Eric a chance to say something. But you weren't ready for me to stop. And you said, wait a minute, you know, I didn't expect you to stop. So notice that break in the synchrony. We quickly fixed that. That's what we call, you know, an error repair, right? So in human interaction, something is what we just did is a universal feature of interaction. It doesn't matter that you're Dutch and I'm American. None of that. When people interact, those are the kinds of patterns we look for. And the little thing that just occurred between us, that happens all the time, billions of times a day all around the planet. But what we're trying to do with all this video data is create a wider professional and public awareness that, look, all of this political hyperbole aside, the success rate of interactions in America between the police and the public is remarkable, right? If you had a sports team that won 97 to 99% of its games, you would think, my God, how do they do it?
Yeah.
And so for us, credit goes to both the public and to police. Why is it that policing is actually incredibly nonviolent almost all the time? And when there is violence, most of it, again, shrill criticism aside, most police violence against combative community members is within the bounds of law and policy. And when violence does occur, the escalation and de-escalation of violence typically follows significant and identifiable patterns.
So is what you're doing also to find the good patterns?
Absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. And here again, I'm going to go back to what Anders taught us. If you were going to teach adaptive decision-making and adaptive expertise, Anders told us years ago, disproportionately focus on success, not failure. So yes, of course, we want to know why in surgery a patient died, or why an airplane crashed, or why a police officer shot a person maybe he shouldn't have shot. We want to know those things. But what we really want to know is why success is the norm in so many fields. And so the fact, when we look at all this video, we can find those positive patterns as well as negative ones and reinforce them. I'm going to bet this is the same situation in Dutch policing as it is here, but here, when I ask police chiefs, find me a really good video of your officers doing an amazing job, where their tactical skills or social skills, their decision-making skills are A+ work, 100% work. They can't do it. They don't know where it is. All they can find is the horrible stuff. And I tell them, isn't that backwards, right? If you're the coach of a winning team and I say, find me your video footage of your last victory. Oh, here it is. Here's that goal, or here's that, here it is. Here's that amazing play. Police chiefs can't do that, which I think, plainly put, is nuts. It's irrational.
Yeah. So say you have found the patterns, maybe you have already found the patterns. Then a very simple thing would be to write down the patterns, to make a checklist, to make a prescription, to teach the prescription.
Yes.
But in other fields, like for example in emergency medicine, they have degree resource management and so on, but they also understood that if you just give people a prescription, it's a prescription. And there are so many anomalies, how to call it?
Anomalies, yeah.
Yeah, and people behave every time a little bit different. So how do you deal with that? Because say for example you come out with the 10 best practices patterns. How are you going to teach that? Are these principles, or are just techniques? What are they?
So they're both, right? They're observable. They're observable patterns which people can teach and improve. And that, of course, is the beauty of working with all the video. Again, much like coaching athletes, we can find patterns in movement, patterns in decision making at scale, and use those to improve individual and team performance. So in a police department, if we go through lots and lots of video and identify key interactional patterns, we can surface those and use those to inform training. So in our vision of all of this, what we're going for here is what my colleagues and I call a data ecology, where, simply put, we gather data, in this case video data, in the operating environment, right? We're recording all this video in the field. We analyze that video. We use that video to improve training. And then we measure the outcomes of that training in the field. And so you've got this endless, this unbreakable loop, this cycle, this data ecology, where if we optimize it, we're using the analytics technology to continually refine training and education. And we identify those patterns because, again, in experts, and this goes back to a lot of Gary Klein's work, experts often, they're very good at what they do, but they're not good at describing what they do and how they do it. The expert doesn't really know what they're doing. Sometimes they do, but many don't. So when we look at lots of data at scale, we can show the experts, well, this is actually what you're doing. This is what's enabling you, for example, to arrest people without violence, or to know that a car is stolen, or to know that a person is carrying a gun, whatever the case may be. When we surface that knowledge, we can then develop the techniques and principles that we can impart to a larger workforce. And, Eric, I think you know this from all the fields you've worked in. At the end of the day, success in high consequence environments, whether it is military operations, aviation, surgery, pick what you want, success almost always comes down to very basic principles. So while it's true that there will be anomalies, some of them incredibly challenging, even in those anomalous situations, it's certain core principles that allows you to rise to the occasion and address that anomaly. So it's finding those core principles and reinforcing them in a sustainable way that we think holds the promise of improving practice.
And did you already found such a principle or such a pattern from analyzing the data, and let's narrow it down to, for example, de-escalation, which is of course a topic more than just words. It's the integration of all those things, eh?
So some of the earliest things, really much of what we find, and I tell people this all the time when I talk about de-escalation, I think the principles of de-escalation are as old as humanity. I don't think there's much that researchers can say about de-escalation that wasn't said by Aristotle, Plato, the Bible, the Quran, Sun Tzu. Pick whatever body of wisdom you want. But I do think what we can do with science and with lots of data is reaffirm and refine core things about human interaction that we've known for thousands of years. So to give you an example, one of the things we look for, one of the things we know works when officers are able to maintain a calm, neutral demeanor in the face of conflict, right? Measured emotional response combined with a strong situational awareness, that is conducive to success. So remember, as I said earlier, with interactions, we're never just looking at what Eric does alone or what Jonathan does alone. We have to look at the system itself. So when we look at interactions, we're looking at them over time. That is to say, from the moment a police officer arrives and steps out of the car, how is that interaction getting better or worse? And how and why is it getting better or worse? What are people saying and doing to make things get better or worse? So we know that part of what we look for is a trend in the change in emotion. So emotions, you can think of emotions as having a value or a valence, positive or negative. You can be, for example, you can be a little bit happy or you can be euphoric, joyful. So emotions have a positive or negative value, and they have an intensity. You can be a little bit upset, or you can be so sad and despondent you might even think about ending your life. So we look at how emotions go up and down in terms of their quality and intensity. And we know when officers can be calm, composed, express themselves in a measured way, that has a positive impact on other people. And it also contributes to the officers having a stronger sense of situational awareness, which allows them to make better decisions. I'll have to show this to you on a future call. Maybe we can do some of this on a future podcast, but we've got a wonderful video, one that comes to mind. It's from the city of Dallas, where I'm located now. We have officers responding to it's a man experiencing a mental health crisis. He's violent, he's combative, he threatens to shoot officers and choke them and so on and so forth. The officers end up having to put their hands on this man. They end up taking him to the ground, but it all happens with a kind of calmness and surgical precision that illustrates the sorts of things I just described here, that even when force is used, it can be used in a precise and compassionate way that can sometimes be a form of de-escalation, right? So when someone is standing there angry and combative, at some point, like someone in a clinical environment, at some point we have to intervene. But those are all things we can capture in video.
A while ago, I think her name was Robin Engel. She studies de-escalation. She was also on the
Yes.
podcast with Chris Butler. And what I heard her say, that there was not much evidence for the effects of de-escalation programs. Does this work, what you are doing right now, do you think will change that, so that we can?
Absolutely, yes. And I'm familiar with Robin's work, and I know Robin. She's done some really good work. So the possibility of analyzing body-worn camera footage on a large scale, I think, is going to transform how we train and educate police. I think it's going to transform what happens in the field. The analogy I like to give people, I'm sure folks, whether they're European or American members of your audience, people are familiar with the Webb Space Telescope, this telescope which has gathered amazing images from deep space and has really changed the way we think about the birth of the universe and how stars and galaxies and black holes and solar systems and galaxies evolve. The Webb telescope, what people don't necessarily know is that all those beautiful images and everything that comes out of that telescope it's the product of AI. So the telescope is gathering a massive amount of data from deep space, and it's through AI models built around the latest astrophysics, cosmology, and so forth that allows those images to be created. In like fashion, we are looking at police interactions at scale, and by looking at a large scale, I think we're going to change how we can train, how we understand. Because I think, Robin's correct, right? Up to this point, there's sort of this black hole, right? We train officers, we put them out on the street, and how do we measure training effect? It's almost impossible.
Yeah.
And one of the mistakes we've made for a long time, something we've learned is that you can't use of force events as a proxy for the effective de-escalation training. In other words, because violent interactions between police and members of the public are so rare, it's very difficult to say that use of force went up or down because of a training intervention. So with some of the newer work we're doing, and this is the project I mentioned around skills of influence, our Virginia Beach project, that is an early effort to look at video footage of de-escalation and look at non-violent events. In other words, rather than looking at violent events where it's impossible to prove the counterfactual, right? If an officer and a citizen get into a fight, it's impossible to reverse engineer that and talk about how the fight could have been prevented.
Mm-hmm.
But it's much easier to say, here are 1,000 situations where the person was agitated, angry, combative, but the officers did a good job of calming it down, right? So of course we need to understand the failures, whether those failures are attributable to the public, to officers, or both. Of course we have to understand failure, especially when those failures result in death or serious injury. But even more important, we have to understand the incredible success rate of policing.
Yeah.
And body-worn camera data lets us do that in a way we've never been able to do before.
So if I summarize it, you have the first system, which analyzes body-worn video footage through all the artificial intelligence procedures you talked about, language processing, video analyzing, thereby finding patterns and core principles, which you can teach, of course, and you can also maybe, how do you call it, analyze the effects of the training. So
Yes, yes, yes.
the circle is, yeah.
Elegantly put. And I would say this, Eric, I would say this to you personally and to all of the people who I know are part of your intellectual and social circle. We know that if our work is going to expand and succeed, we need to enlist the wisdom and experience of people like you who understand the operating environment and who understand expert decision making. AI is rapidly proliferating all around the world. The application of AI is rapidly proliferating. I tell people all the time, artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor intelligent, right? At the end of the day, AI is nothing more, nothing less than powerful computer tools to help people manage very, very large piles of unstructured data. But like any other technology people have ever invented, it's no better or no worse than the people who use it. To that point, we need to enlist the best and brightest minds to help us improve what we do. If we're going to use AI to improve policing or aviation or medicine or how we teach sports, anything, we need experts in decision making and experts in those different fields to come to the table and help us and help other people make the algorithms, make the analytic models as accurate as possible. We've already seen, and this is not a scientific conclusion, but I'm just going to offer this up anecdotally to your audience. When we have played around with analyzing police video using the big open source AI tools like ChatGPT, those tools they're not giving us the level of accuracy and detail and fidelity we need, because frankly, those tools are scraping massive amounts of publicly available data. So we don't think that the way to improve policing is to use Chat GPT to analyze video, right? To just let people do it by themselves any more than we would improve surgery that way. For us, the way forward is to bring together experts in professions, experts in the skills that make those professions succeed, and use those experts to inform the development and refinement and application of AI. And we also have to get all the stakeholders to the table, community people, trainers, researchers, and use AI tools in the most robust, intellectual, and ethical way to get us where I think we can go.
Yes, because that's what I wanted to ask you also. Are there some ethical challenges? For example,
Absolutely.
I recently saw, I'm not sure where, I know where, but let's give it out. But there were some AI systems who could choose in wars, they could choose the targets and make a decision if a drone will kill the bad guys or not without human interference. This is, of course, a very extreme example, but what are the challenges if we just go back to policing and police decision making based on AI?
So whenever we have the potential to analyze a large body of sensitive data using AI, that raises all kinds of legal and ethical and political challenges. Something I've said for years, and you, Eric, you'll understand this from your own experience, policing is very intimate, right? The police step into people's lives at moments of enormous intimacy and vulnerability. So not least of all, the millions and millions of videos stored around the world contain all kinds of very sensitive and difficult moments. Analyzing that data in ways that are effective, but nonetheless protect and affirm human dignity is critically important. I think it's an inevitability in modern society. The rapid evolution of science and technology always outstrips, pulls ahead of the ability of law and policy and ethics to keep up, right? There's new technology, there's a radical change, and now inevitably law, policy, and ethics have to scramble to keep up. So I fully acknowledge, I would be delusional if I didn't acknowledge the many challenges inherent to using AI to analyze policing. We are part of conversations to try to make that process ethical. We have a great relationship with Microsoft. I just want to give, acknowledge our Microsoft colleagues who I think are really trying to think through at a very large scale, much larger than Polis will ever be, how to use AI in an ethical manner that improves outcomes for the criminal justice system, that serves rather than undermines the interests of democratic society. But it's tough. It's
Yeah.
very tough. And I don't think anybody should shy away from embracing and confronting those challenges.
Maybe as we evolve as a species, we need some new Aristotle's, Plato's, and wise men to use all the tools. So you moved from police officer to other projects. Now you're into high tech.
Yes. So
Yeah,
we really, we had done the work in technology for a number of years at DARPA. The basic financial reality is that in the US, and I'm sure it's probably the same in Europe, the money for research and development is much more readily available in the national security domain than it is in policing.
yeah.
So it took us a long time to get research and development money from the federal government to start the work out of which TrustStat evolved. Unfortunately, we were able to get some additional resources from Microsoft, which has allowed us to accelerate our work. But yeah, for us, it's a very exciting transformation of our work. It's a chance to take the research, to take the theoretical principles that we hold close to our hearts, and think about ways to bring those principles to life on a larger scale.
What drives you, and what did drive you all those years? What is your what is your motivation? What makes you wake up every day?
For my colleagues and me, it's a firm belief, it's a hopeful belief that we can make a difference, right? That we can make the world a better place. We are very fortunate to have spent a lot of time literally on the street We understand what's at stake when police officers interact with the public. We understand that it has life and death consequences every time. We also have the good fortune to have spent a lot of time as researchers and academics thinking about all of this. So we take the optimism born of being in both domains and thinking about how to fuse them together, right? I think there are a lot of people in the practical world who sometimes get upset and they think, my God, how do we solve these problems and what do we do? And there are people in the academic world who think, well, I like all this work, but how do I make a difference? We try to bridge that, right? We try to bridge that divide between researchers and practitioners and say, the divide is not as wide as you think it is. So for us, it's a hope that as the motto of our company says, we can analyze social interactions and make them better. We try to do that every day. And I'd like to believe we make a difference.
Great. So if we talk again in, let's say, 10 years, what would be the conversation look like if you could say it?
That's a great question. I love that. So 10 years from now, I would like to think that the kind of technology we've just released will be prolific, not just in policing, but in other domains, right? That people will have started to apply technology like this in a much more affordable way. And I would like to think that the data we are able to gather will have started to transform training, education, and practice in a number of different domains, in policing, in emergency medicine, in private safety and security, in schools and public education. I recently was doing some writing around the evolution of body-worn cameras, and I came upon a report from 2012, not very long ago, 12 years ago, just over a decade. This was a report written by the U.S. federal government. And in this report from 2012, the federal government said, the body-worn cameras are new and they're promising, but we don't really know what to do with them. There isn't policy. The technology is not right yet. And the law is not right in the right place, the ethics. So there was this, as recently as 12 years ago, the cameras were still seen as a novelty for which law, policy, and ethics didn't have a lot of answers. Now look how far we've come. I think we're at another inflection point, at another crossroads, where today we've now been gathering all this data for over a decade. We have petabytes and petabytes of data. I think a decade from now, we're going to start to say, wow, we've started to analyze this data and the results have been remarkable. And we're able to think about policing in new ways that wouldn't have been possible back in 2024. Now, Eric,
Wow.
you got to record this and play it back for me in 2034 and see what I got wrong and see what I got right.
Yeah. And say, for example, if you are a Dutch police trainer, police chief, police researcher in the Netherlands, can you give one more time? What can my colleagues in the Netherlands do right now? Of course, they don't have the system, but what can they learn from this right now, and what can they do in the future with what you are developing right now?
So first of all, we'd be delighted to talk to people in the Netherlands or anywhere in the world, right? There's no inherent reason this technology can't be used anywhere on the planet Earth, right? But I think my respectful suggestion for Dutch police agencies would be take a step back and think about this conversation you and I have had today, right? How are Dutch police agencies gathering video data? Where does it go? And how does it get used? And thinking especially about large agencies, right, like Amsterdam, what could be done even at a small scale to identify patterns of success and use those to better inform outcomes between Dutch police officers and members of Dutch society.
Yeah, great. To end this conversation, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Eric. I cut you. Go ahead.
Did I forget to ask a question which you have prepared for maybe, or you would like to offer the listeners? Did I forget to ask you something important?
No, I don't know. I think we've covered a lot of ground. I don't think so. No. But I just wanted to quickly say this back to your question about Dutch policing. with all due respect to my many colleagues in the American police world from which I come from, I think there is an intellectual rigor and sophistication and an embrace of science in police research in Europe that frankly we don't always have here in the US. Um, I think there's a receptivity to science in countries like the Netherlands, in Western Europe. I think there's a lot of fertile ground for this technology in Europe that is as fertile, if not more fertile, than some of the conditions here in the US.
Okay, that's great to hear. And if researchers are listening from universities in the Netherlands or in Europe, can they contact you if they're interested in getting to know what you're doing?
Absolutely. We
Yeah,
absolutely we have friends and colleagues all over the world. We we would be delighted to talk to anybody anywhere about ways to make better use of our research and technology, for the benefit of humanity, whatever race, color, creed, nation. We believe in that good stranger concept, right? How do we improve outcomes wherever those might be on the planet?
great. Now, here in Netherlands, tonight, the Dutch soccer team is playing against France. So this evening, nobody's here anymore. But for the other non-soccer watchers, what is the best book to take this evening if you are not watching football? What is a
Oh,
good
best
book? Yeah, best book. It doesn't have to be related to policing, can be, but what do you think is?
oh best book. Wow, what am I? Oh, you know what? I'm going to here. I'm going to in real time. I'm going to look this up. This is one of my favorite reads later, and I'm going to be. I don't want to get the title wrong on but I just read this. My brother sent me this book, and I loved it because it's really nicely captures some of the political complexities in the world today.
Hmm.
Yes, it's the book. It's called The Tragic Mind.
Ah,
The Tragic Mind, Fear, Fate, and the Burden of Power. Um, it's a book about the exercise of political power under very, very difficult circumstances. And as you and I talked about earlier, Eric, um,
yeah.
we're in some very troubling times all around the world today. And I think the the ability of people to wrestle with the complexities of political power is so important in the current climate, wherever that is.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your service, for all your research, and for combining all those wisdom from the European traditions, US traditions, technology, all those scientific fields. Great, very inspiring, Jonathan.
No, thanks, Eric. It's a pleasure to chat with you. Thank you so much for a great conversation. It's always good talking to you, and I look forward to talking more with you and all the folks in your audience. Take care. All the best.
Thank you so much. I will end this section and we will say goodbye off the record.
Excellent.
So thank you again for listening to this podcast. I think very inspiring podcast, a lot of information. And as Jonathan says, maybe it can change training completely if we can use the tools Jonathan is talking about in the video and so on. So thank you for listening and till the next time. Bye bye.